Hi, welcome to Conversations with Hannah. This month I'm joined by two gentlemen who you will all recognize, Town Manager Kevin Mizikar and our Superintendent of Schools, Joe Sawyer. And we've come together today to talk about the upcoming May 4th election, in which we have the $9.5 million operational override on the ballot, and just to talk a little bit more and make sure that all voters are really aware of how we arrived at the decision to place an override on the ballot, and also what are the compelling reasons that people should be considering as they take this vote. As you both know, because you get probably way too much email and calls from me, I have the honor of serving not only as the state rep, but I also serve on Shrewsbury Finance Committee. I was appointed in 2014 by Chris Mena at the time, and I find it to be an incredibly rewarding opportunity, but also for me, being somebody who looks at both a state budget and a town budget, I also a lot of times can connect the dots between things that are happening on both levels. And so I wanted to speak today not so much as a state representative, but really as an informed, almost I think 20-year town meeting member and 7-year member of the Finance Committee about why I think it's so important that we as a community recognize where we are at in terms of our financial system, and also to understand that we are an incredibly well-managed community. My colleagues and I often talk about the communities that we represent, and I am always very proud to say that I represent Shrewsbury and Westboro. And one of the things that is most similar between the two towns is the incredibly well-managed and well-led municipality that we have, and both sort of in people in positions like yourselves, and also in our elected capacity. So it is with that vein behind us that I think we should talk about how we're arriving at having to have an operational override on the ballot. And I don't know, Kevin, if you want to talk about just a little bit, making sure people are even aware of what a Prop 2.5 override is, and why it is that we put one before the voters. Sometimes I think people think that's an oddity, or it serves as some sort of something has happened that shouldn't have happened, and yet the law actually calls for that.
Sure, yeah. So Proposition 2.5 is a late 1970s law that went into effect in 1980. And in and of itself, it said municipalities can't raise taxes more than 2.5% in any given year. So year over year, taxes can only go up 2.5%. That was really a result of some mismanagement in other communities, certainly not in Shrewsbury. If you look at the track record, even in the 70s, of significant tax increases, 10%, 12%, in other municipalities in the state. So while the legislature and the state at the time said, municipalities should be limited to 2.5% every year as a standard, it wasn't the sole aspect or the only way to do business. They also had the foresight to put in an override opportunity where communities could simply go to their voters and make the case that they needed more than 2.5% in any given year. So the override isn't a new concept. It wasn't an afterthought of that legislation. It was a tool that was given to municipalities that you just need to make the case to your community. Ask the voters if you're allowed to raise more than 2.5%. And it's certainly been done hundreds or over 1,000 times since 1980, whenever the law came into effect. And I think more and more over the recent years, a lot of communities are seeing that it's a needed tool that they have to access more and more, because property taxes is our number one source of revenue, and throughout the Commonwealth, obviously, a lot of land has been taken up since 1980, and so you don't see that extraordinary growth year after year to keep up with really the cost factors that we see to run and provide services to the residents. So it's a tool that's been in the toolkit as long as Proposition 2.5 has been there.
And we, years ago, started taking a look at what we could do when we really found ourselves approaching a structural deficit situation where we just didn't have enough revenue to cover our costs. And the first thing that we did, the selectmen had appointed two fiscal study committees back when Dan Morgado was town manager to really think both on the revenue side, what's the opportunity out there, and on the expense side, is there anything else we can be doing? And both of those fiscal study committees really came away saying we've done almost everything that we can be doing, which was good news, again, because it meant the town was being extremely well managed and extremely fiscally responsible. And yet it also allowed, I think, the voters to understand when the 2014 override was placed before us, that our community had done its homework. It was doing all the things that you would want to see a community doing, and yet because of huge cost pressure, things that had increased significantly are hard to balance out in that 2.5%. And so, we find ourselves in that situation again. And I think it would probably be helpful to explain why do we have a structural deficit, and then what were the pressures that we faced in particular this last year that really just exacerbated the situation.
Yeah, so a structural deficit simply is your recurring revenues do not match your recurring or your ongoing expenses. So, again, 2.5% is basically on average between 2.5% and 3% total revenue growth that we have every year. In inflation and other cost factors that we deal with as a municipality being heavily oriented on staffing, salary expenses and costs associated with that, like health insurance, that we've really been seeing trending 6, 8, 10% a year, has just grown that gap between what our ongoing revenues are and what our ongoing expenses are. And there's that arbitrary cap again that the legislature said, this is all you get unless you ask for more directly from your community. So that gap has just grown over the years, and we can't continue to provide the services with the revenues that we have in comparison to what those expenses would be to cover those. So there's a lot of factors that go into why we're here right now, but the pandemic certainly is one of them because our revenues are down. Our third largest revenue category is local receipts, and that's very elastic. It depends on people buying new cars. It depends on people going out to eat, staying in hotels. Mm-hmm. People aren't doing that. So we believe, or the data shows, we're about $3.8 million off of the revenue level that we would have been at if there was no pandemic. And that, so that's a backwards looking time from fiscal year 19. That's a significant amount of revenue for us. It's more than Proposition 2.5 would provide in and of itself. Proposition 2.5 provides about $3 million a year. Yep. So take $3.8 million away, we're in a revenue deficit, over that time period.
We had also anticipated having some additional revenue open to us with our retirement contributions being fully made. And again, the good news is, which I don't want anyone to not understand, is that Shrewsbury is one of the few communities in the Commonwealth who is set to be able to say that we have fully funded our retirement contribution, and then with an ongoing, much lower rate that we need to put in on an annual basis. So the good news is, we are far and ahead away from other communities and where they stand on having a significant obligation that they don't yet have funded. Right. That being said, we had sort of anticipated that around this time, but the market fluctuates, and so we needed to make some additional larger payments.
Yep. Yeah, so our pension, we do an actuarial analysis every year. I won't go into the boring details, but
I've sat through it. It's very boring.
Basically our advisor said, it would take about 3 more years for, the projection. We thought we could accomplish it by 2022, and based on all the baseline data that we put in and the assumptions that we ask him to make about growth, it's going to take a couple more years to get there.
And so I think we have about a $4.5 million hole, correct, in our budget right now, largely due to funding in our largest area, which is the schools, which again is consistent in communities. It is oftentimes the largest part of a budget. And yet, even though it's a large part of our budget, the funding that we put in actually puts us at almost the bottom on a per pupil spending, which makes it even more miraculous that we're able to have such an incredibly high calibered public school system with the resources that we do have. And that is something that clearly our residents value. And as a mom of 2 kids in college, I can number the times that they have called home to say how much better prepared they felt for college than some of their peers who are there as well. So we know that we have an excellent product in our school system. And again, a school system that has done everything possible to ensure that every dollar is being spent as efficiently and effectively as possible. And yet here we are. And so Joe, can you tell us a little bit about, not only what this year the impact would be if we don't pass the override, but even last year you had to make some significant cuts and choices on how to deal with not being able to have enough funding.
Sure, no, thank you. And again, those anecdotal pieces about students who have gone off to college, we hear that a lot, and that's something that we feel good about. And certainly on lots of different metrics, our outcomes compare very favorably. And it really, both as superintendent and as a parent of a recent graduate, my oldest is in college this year and feeling similarly, and I've got 2 more in the system, and it's a wonderful community to raise your family and have your kids go to school, and that's something that we want to preserve and conserve for the community. I think that it's always been, as you mentioned, a very well-managed community in terms of its local government, and the schools are no exception to that. There's been a long tradition of making really good use of the funding that we do have and concentrating that on high leverage things that work well for students' education. At the same time, there have been times over, certainly I'm going on about a quarter century in the school district, it's hard to believe, starting off as a school-based administrator. This is my 13th year, I think, as superintendent. And we've gone through these cycles where, early in my career, the growth of the community was really fueling that new growth that Kevin talked about, was fueling the ability to add staff as the student population rose. And then 2 things happened, whereas the increase of the number of houses in the community and new residents sort of flattened out, the increase in the students was continuing to tick upwards. And at the same time, the state changed the funding formula to really take into account a community's economic ability to pay, so to speak, in terms of their income and property wealth. And so with state funding really flattening, more pressure for all the different cost increases that, and I can talk more about that are kind of just baked into any public school district, we really got into a situation where we had to make a lot of reductions. And so before the 2014 override, we had really high class sizes in a lot of places. 30 kids in a class in 2nd grade, which is just unacceptable really to the community. I think that's what really created the impetus for that particular override. Since then, we had a couple of years where we made it through without any cuts having to be made, maybe added a little bit here and there. But we also had some years where we had to make some reductions around the edges until this current year, when we had to cut about $1.9 million out of the budget, about 30 positions. That was everything from spending less on materials and curriculum and books, spending less on professional development for our staff, but most importantly and most damaging was cutting a whole lot of positions. We cut foreign language, world language teachers at Sherwood Middle School, so we no longer have foreign language in 6th grade. We cut reading tutors at the elementary level. We cut teachers at elementary, middle, and high school that increased our class sizes. We cut our advanced math coaches at the middle level. We cut our drama teacher at Oak Middle School. Some of these were through attrition, we just didn't replace them. Excuse me. But it was really something where we took a pretty big hit for this current year, and I think that got lost in the shuffle a little bit with COVID because we had some money from the federal government and that came funneled through the state, thank goodness, that allowed us to hire some of the staff we needed to hire just for this year for remote learning and things of that nature. But there are some there's programming our kids are not getting this year that they would have received if we had an adequate budget. For next year, we're talking about a gap of about $4.5 million at this point, which would mean somewhere in the order of about 50 positions that we'd have to reduce from the budget. It will really increase class sizes all over the place. Most importantly, it really jeopardizes the opening of the new Beale School because that is not only replacing an old building with a new modern building, it's also taking enrollment pressure and overcrowding, addressing that at all of our elementary schools. And to do that, we have to hire more teachers as we staff that school up. And then, beyond that, we're talking about things like closing our elementary library media centers. This is not a community where we should be saying to that we can't afford to have our libraries open for our elementary school kids. And it really, frankly, turned my stomach to even make that recommendation of the school committee. But over time, this sort of slow drip that turned into the last couple of years because of that structural deficit Kevin talked about, the need for more dramatic measures in order to balance the budget really came forward. So I'm deeply appreciative that the community has the opportunity to use the tool of Proposition 2.5 to provide the funding to the town government, including the school department, that will enable us to stop any further cuts, actually add a few positions back even next year, a couple of teachers at Sherwood and a couple at the high school, and open the new school as intended. And at the same time, as I believe, do that with the, an increase to all of our taxes for sure, but at the same time, still maintaining a tax rate that's lower than virtually any place around here. So it's something it's a really critically important choice that the community faces with this election.
Yeah, and you're talking about when the state funding formula changed. I mean, again, sometimes there's things that go on that are just not as transparent to the general public and the general voters. And one of the things was when the state put in their funding formula, we were held harmless. We actually should have been putting in more through our property taxes to fund education. The state held communities harmless. They didn't say, okay, now all of a sudden, you're going to have this delta you need to make up this year. But there was also a hope that there would be progress towards that to get closer to what we should be funding through our local property tax dollars as opposed to what the state should be putting in. And so, that over a long period of time now is also one of the underlying themes that we have. And I know when my daughter Madison, who's a sophomore in college now, when she was a freshman, when she was in first grade and had Mrs. Kelly, I think she had 20 or 21 kids in her class. When my son Patrick was there 5 years later as a freshman, he ended up having in Mrs. Grossman's class, I think 33 kids. I mean, in just a short period of time, but that pressure that happened. And that makes a huge difference in the opportunity to learn, the opportunity for the teacher to spend time with students on an individual basis. And certainly this year with the overcrowding, on top of how that is not helpful in a normal year, in a year where we have to be cognizant of what's going on in the public with health concerns, we don't want to be in a situation where we have more kids in a classroom than should be reasonable given what's going on with the epidemic. I think, too, another way in which probably it's not always as easy for the general public to see, you mentioned the advanced math coaches. And I know years ago, one of the reasons that we put advanced math coaches in is because we were losing at the time in the middle schools a high number of students to charter schools who were going there to seek some of that higher end level math and science. And by having these advanced math coaches, again, not a huge cost overall, and comparatively saved us a ton of money that was going out of the district that we wanted to keep here. Those are ways in which we save money by doing some things. One of the other ways that I think, as a community, we're all really proud that we have a AAA bond rating right now, which is just incredible. So something to be so incredibly proud of, and again, really speaks to the hallmark of the leadership in our community. But that also has a huge bearing on what we pay when we go to the market for bonds. And, if we don't pass an override, that rating could be in jeopardy. The rating agencies could take a look at us and say, you know what, we don't really think you're AAA material anymore, we're going to move you down. And Kevin, can you speak to what that might mean in terms of, again, the differential that we might have to pay in an interest rate?
Yeah, it's something that I've been thinking about a lot lately because we continue to see amazing rates. So one, the market's a little bit better than it has been in the past few years. There's no doubt about it. But I look at Beal, and when we borrowed for that's the first time we received the AAA rating. So all of our analysis was based on a AA plus rating, which is the next lower down. But when we accessed the market for Beal and went actually 2 levels up, we saved for Beal over $4 million from our baseline analysis. So, and then thereafter that, we borrowed for the police station again. So I've really been thinking, wow, those are 2 similar borrowings. And if we were just at a AA plus, the community may already be paying $9.5 million extra for these 2 projects with no really added extra value.
Right.
$4 million and $4 million, you're at $8 million just for those 2 borrowings alone. So that's kind of the hard thing to see. Whenever you go in and if you're looking for a mortgage rate for your house, you can get more house the lower your interest rate. It's the same concept. Our tax rate greatly benefits from a AAA bond rating, and it means we have to have a healthy financial condition to be able to do that. We can't be cut to the bone each and every year. We can't draw down on reserves. So the more and more I've been thinking about this, last week, actually earlier this week, we refunded the Sherwood bonds, 10 years old now, and we got an interest rate of 0.75%, so 0.75%, which is just amazing.
I think my car loan is higher.
yeah, exactly. And that in and of itself will save us about $1.9 million over the next 10 years. So we're not extending the term, we're just saving money. It's just a lower payment. So it's just like refinancing your house. You get a lower payment, but the same house. So it's vitally important, but it goes on in the background. It's money that we don't have to put on the taxpayers or onto the tax rate. So it's kind of hard to see, but.
Well, again, when we built Sherwood, that project came in under budget, under time, saving the taxpayers money. We've had that experience in most all of the building projects that we've had, and even in Beale right now, I think we're seeing the same thing. And again, that goes because we have excellent leadership in the community. And I think, part of what you want to have in a community is to be a draw for excellent managers, and no one wants to be in charge of dismantling an excellent school system or dismantling what has been built in the town. And that is something that, again, it's hard to put a price on when you're just talking in general, but it's something that we need to be really cognizant of as a community, because if we choose not to fund the $9.5 million, we could in effect be charging ourselves so much more in the long run by making that choice. And so, one of the other ways in which I think if you don't have kids in the school system and you haven't had them in, the last decade, you're probably unaware of how much transference of cost has gone on. Public education has always been a responsibility of all taxpayers to fund. And in the last, I think probably 15 years or so, maybe less, we have started to transfer more and more of the cost onto the parents of school students. So I know when our kids were there in the school system, we paid a bus fee, which was not something I paid the first year Madison went to school, but in subsequent years I ended up having to pay as a parent. The athletic and activities fees are an enormous amount of money for families, and yet it's a critical part of student learning, and it's also part of your student presenting themselves to their next opportunity in life, whether that's going on to college, if it's going right into the career, if it's going to the military. Those things matter, those opportunities, when you're being evaluated. So, Joe, I don't know if you can speak to that, and I know that you in the school committee talk about often the issue of having to ask parents to pay for things. But,
Sure.
In 2014, there weren't any fees removed from the parent population, and there aren't any scheduled to be removed if this goes through either, other than kindergarten tuition.
Kindergarten tuition will be the one, and the school committee did vote recently for next year that they were going to freeze all of the fees and tuitions where they were in terms of the rates that were established originally for this year. Some of them we didn't charge a bus fee this year just because of the pandemic situation, but based on where they were at, because obviously the school committee is very cognizant that they're asking, all families are also taxpayers and or pass through costs of that if they're renting, and they don't want them to be subject to increases there as well. The school committee has always, even when they adopted fees for the first time and to this day, don't like the idea of it, and really think that public education should not be funded to some degree by user fees for things that are really core, such as getting your kid to and from school, or being able to play on an athletic team, or take part in a school musical, or whatever it might be. But not unique to Shrewsbury. This has been something that, because of some of the limitations of things like Proposition 2.5 that school districts have chosen to do in order to make sure they're not cutting more core services for things, and they can only charge for things that aren't considered to be part of the sort of core public education, that they're more optional, but still really important parts of that educational experience. Unfortunately, the fees in Shrewsbury, as a result of some of the difficulties we've had with the structural deficit, are higher than they are in some other communities. So that transference of cost to families has been more dramatic than it has been in some other places. And that's something that hopefully over time, and I know we'll talk a little bit about what this will look like with this particular approach to the override that the town is taking, that with some stability in our budgets through the town funding and state, hopefully over time, that's something that, other than sort of marginal inflationary kinds of adjustments, there wouldn't have to be anything dramatically done. The good news is the kindergarten tuition would be eliminated next year if the override is successful. That's something that very few districts in the state charge for full-day kindergarten. 96% or so of districts offer full-day K, which we're still not able to offer to all kids. We will be able to next year with the additional space that the new Beale building brings on board. And then also we've been stepping down that tuition. So we're very hopeful that with the successful outcome on May 4th, that will be the last time that parents will have paid for a kindergarten experience, which again, that's the norm around our state at this point as well. But I was pleased that the school committee saw fit to freeze fees where they are for next year. Again, we're really hopeful that the stability, if the community does choose to support the override, which I hope they do, it will be a game changer in that for the first time in my career in Shrewsbury, we'll be able to look over a multiple year time horizon, know we have financial stability, and focus our time and effort and expertise of our leadership team and our educators on making our schools better, not trying to play defense against what do we have to do to try to protect what we have, knowing we're going to probably have to make some cuts, if not this year, maybe next year, which just makes strategic planning all that much more challenging. And we've done some really good strategic work over the last decade plus, even before that as well, but I think that it still has been challenging because it's been in fits and starts because we've had that lack of financial stability. So that's something that I think is really one of the real keys to this approach.
When after the 2014 override, you had presented myself and Beth Cassavant and Jason Palich and Suzanne Remington and I think a few others batons from the school to sort of thank us for helping run the race. And I think that was it was such a really meaningful way to think about what we'd been through. And I also sort of feel like the baton has also been handed off to Kevin in the sense that, with your leadership coming in, along with the selectmen and Joe and the school committee, we really started to think about how to manage this through the longer term. Because again, structural deficits don't disappear overnight. You have to figure out how to manage them. There's always going to be cost pressures. And so, Kevin, you working with Joe, and I know a small subcommittee of school committee and selectmen really thought through, how can we approach this in a way that, as Joe says, does provide some stability. And it's still, again, under the ever-present way in which we do business here in Shrewsbury, which is to be extremely fiscally responsible. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the model that you helped lead? Sure. And what that means to the community? Yeah,
sure. So, well, thank you for that. I mean, it truly was a team effort to develop this approach that we're taking. We look to use an override stabilization fund, and that means that because we have this arbitrary 2.5% cap, we need funding to sustain ourselves over a longer period of time as to not have to come back year after year. So the concept would be to have an override at $9.5 million, but roughly a third of that would go into the stabilization fund in the first year to be used in future years. So the one chart that, we're talking about stability and funding, the one chart that I remember that we put together over the last 18 years kind of looked like an EKG, right? Like up and down and up and down and a flat line and up. And so we want it to be a nice smooth level of funding so we can plan. So that's the concept of the override stabilization. You put, funding in early, and then you draw down upon that over year, because we recognize the fact that our expenses go up more than 2.5%, and our new revenues only going to go up 2.5% every year after the override. So a little extra funding in the beginning, and then we draw down from that savings account over time. It's almost like a 401k or something like that, like a pension, where you contribute, up front, and then you draw down a little bit over time to sustain your expenditures. So I think it's a concept it is a concept that's been proven in other communities, including Arlington. It's kind of the Arlington model, as we've referred to it. And I think it will benefit the community, provide stability. And I also think it just gives the taxpayers a kind of a bookend of what they're voting on. It brings some certainty to it. So I think hopefully they understand that, the taxpayers understand that, and will feel comfort in that we're not going to come back a year later or anything like that. It's 4 years is the commitment, and we'll do everything that we can to get year 5 or year 6 out of it if possible. That's our goal, but true core commitment for 4 years.
And I think too, it's folks a lot of time they see selectmen and school committee people if they tune in or they watch the replays. Like the only person who I know actually watches the replays is Beth Cassavant. But the opportunity there is to see those meetings. But the reality is the folks who serve as selectmen and school committee members are working all the time on these issues. And in particular, Beth Cassavant, who's chair of the Board of Selectmen this year, and Sandy Fritz, who's the chair of the school committee, have been doing an enormous amount of work behind the scenes with other members of their boards to really see this model through to fruition. And both the Selectmen and School Committee and Finance Committee all unanimously supported this because it does give a solid foundation to work from. It's something that everyone understands where we're at and what the game plan is, and there's no more mystery to trying to figure out what the delta is going to be and then how to fill that every year. I think the one thing that people probably have some thoughts about and want information on is the notion of the American Rescue Plan dollars that certainly have been talked about. And we have spent a lot of time talking about them because we still don't have clear guidance from the federal government yet. It takes a period of time for that to be put out, and we've experienced that the last year with some other rounds. So we're hoping by mid-May to get something at the state level, and then that will probably again take a little bit of time, probably a month or so, to get to the local level. But the one thing that we do know is that the ARP funds, they don't solve our problem. They can be helpful in certain ways, but one of the challenges is you never want to put a lot of money into your operational budget in 1 year, because the next year when you don't have it, it creates an even larger gap that you have to figure out. So we need to be strategic on those funds. And perhaps, Kevin, you can talk about what are some of the ways that we think we can use those funds based on what we have seen so far.
Yeah, so we understand there's 4 big buckets we can spend from or are eligible to spend from. So the first is pandemic response, right? So our continued efforts. We all know that COVID-19 is not going away at the end of the fiscal year. It's not, it's unfortunately popping up, pretty significantly in some other states. So we're going to have to manage costs. And so that's the first bucket. And just kind of as a footnote on that, we've spent about between $5 and $6 million on managing direct pandemic costs between town and school operations over the last, 13 months or so. So it's not an insignificant amount of money. It takes a lot of money to do business differently and provide safety to students and employees and things like that. Then the second is premium pay for essential workers. I don't have a lot of idea what that may mean, but it's one of the buckets that the town would have the decision to make. Essential workers, frontline workers, public health nurses, police and fire that still went to that call last March when we were all kind of huddled in our house going, what is going on? And then public infrastructure, some infrastructure. So water and sewer and broadband are 3 things that are named in one of the buckets. I asked, maybe by mistake, or maybe I regret it, I asked DPW director, get me a list of what you have, and then of course I get a list of $125 million worth of projects. So plenty of opportunities to draw down on our infrastructure needs. And then finally, the ability to supplement lost revenues. So that's kind of, I think, the most hopeful area that could be the most flexible that we could use to help lower the impact on the taxpayer. But again, it's a one-time source of revenue. So if, it's like getting a a loan from someone or hitting the lottery, once you draw down on it, it doesn't replenish itself. It's gone. So even if we're able, and I hope that we're able, because we're going to be as strategic as possible to lessen the impact on the taxpayers if we can, using revenue replacement. But again, it's a one-time, it's a single lump sum of money that will go away. So once you get beyond it, we'll have a bigger cliff, a greater structural deficit, if you will, to deal with.
I think that's a really good explanation. And again, I think that we will be as thoughtful as possible on how to maximize those funds. I mean, I think back to when we went through the recession in 2008, 2009, it was the school system under your leadership who smartly said, even though they sort of gave us a year to use this, we think we can find a way to leverage this over 3 years to draw out this funding. And so I have the full faith that, our community will make the right decisions. And again, I think that the selectmen and the school committee and the finance committee all have the same resolve around that and understanding of the best way to do that. I think, one of the other final areas that I think some people have talked to me about in the past is, a belief, a school system, the largest cost is our people, our educators and the staff who are there. And, like you would expect Shrewsbury to be, we are not the top payer in the Commonwealth for our teachers. We're certainly not the lowest, but we also have to be cognizant of communities around us who also can be very attractive to our staff. So can you just talk a little bit, Joe, about where our staffing falls in terms of comparative nature, and then what you also see, and you mentioned this at our finance committee meeting last week, one of the reasons that people do choose to come to Shrewsbury, which is a non-specific salary item, but more of a town that they want to be in, a community that they want to be an educator in.
Sure. I think the school committee over time has done an excellent job of continuing to focus on attracting and retaining talented educators and doing that in a variety of ways. Compensation is one of those things, of course, and I think that the statistics show that, for the comparable communities we have, whether that's geographically, and of course there are some comparable communities not only geographically but in terms of socioeconomically that are pretty similar. When you look at sort of, especially down the Route 9 corridor, Westboro, Northboro, and Southboro, certainly Grafton, what we pay our educators and our educational leaders is very consistent around what those communities would make. We're not, again, the highest paid, but certainly competitive for the market. It's not something that, in my experience, we found that we're having trouble attracting good candidates. Even though we may not pay the highest, we're paying enough that people say, yeah, that's a fair amount of money for the kind of work that would be expected. I think the sort of non-compensation piece that you're alluding to, that we talked about a little bit at Finance Committee, is that, what does it look like to practice my profession in this school district? What kind of resources will I have? What kind of school building will I be working in? And of course, Shrewsbury has really stepped up and done a lot for school building infrastructure, going back to 1997 when Floral Street opened, when I came to Shrewsbury, and we'll have to continue to do that with some of our older schools. But the New Beale School is another example. I mean, I can imagine that if someone's putting in an application, they've seen the presentations we have online. Who wouldn't want to work in a school like that physically? We've always been very good about leveraging our budget around focusing on appropriate use of technology. Our teachers have really good access to educational technology. That was something that put us ahead of the curve when the pandemic started, which was a good thing. But then it's access to other great educators who have similar core values and who are focused on doing great things for kids. And that's something that, if you have a situation where you're not retaining good staff, and the word starts to get out that, especially not necessarily because you're not earning enough, because I think that part is pretty baked in. It's really more about, is my job at risk? If I'm a newer educator, and the way the system works, whether you'd like it or not, is that you're more likely to be at risk of being laid off if you're a newer career person. And so if you're making a decision between a district that hasn't laid anybody off for financial reasons in years and years, in Shrewsbury, where maybe a few people got laid off a couple of years ago, and if this, if we don't get this override and we're cutting, over 2 years, cutting about 80 jobs, it's going to be pretty hard to attract new people to say, "Ooh, yeah, I really want to put my my roots down and start to develop a career in Shrewsbury," not knowing if the next year maybe my position is going to disappear because the district can't afford it anymore. And given the financial resources we do have collectively as a community, we shouldn't be in that position. There's going to be occasions where there's really difficult economic times, and all school districts are struggling to maintain what's happening, kind of what happened in 08 and 09, and hopefully with stimulus funds and things, you muddle your way through. But the structural deficit Shrewsbury's been dealing with has put us in a negative way as an outlier compared to some of our peer districts that we compete with for talent. So that's something I think that the stability that Kevin's talking about, which I think it's a brilliant approach that Kevin has brought forward, and that the selectmen and the school committee and the finance committee have all unanimously endorsed, with this stabilization fund approach to an override to give us that stability. That's a real selling point. As I think about recruiting new people, or we've had a remarkably stable leadership team over time, but there's going to be times where we're going to have some turnover. People may be promoted to something different somewhere else, or people are going to come to retirement age. And when we're trying to attract really great school leaders, they're going to look at things like that. What does it look like to be in that community? Am I going to be managing a lot of cuts, or am I going to be able to plan and be really strategic because there's financial stability? And so I think that's a really key element. I think you alluded to it before, Hannah. I mean, we're in the bottom 11% of districts in the state in per pupil spending. I think for administrative costs, we're like bottom 5% or even less than that. Our cost efficiency is really high, but it's tripped over to the other side of being cost effective, to being like we're just not spending enough. And just like any organization, if you're a business and you're not charging enough to cover your costs, maybe you're not going to stay in business, right? And we don't have a choice. We have to stay in business. We're going to be in business next year. The question is, what's the quality of what we can provide to our customers? And it isn't like a business where you can say, well, we're going to stop, we're going to get out of that product line. We're just going to focus on this. There's things that we have to do. And we're mandated by law to do, and those are the things that are going to get the first dollars, and that means other things like elementary libraries or having class sizes that are reasonable. Those are the things that go out the door if you don't have enough money. So I can't emphasize, we're going to have high school kids next year who can't get AP classes that they need and want to put on their transcript for college. We're going to have kids who can't get electives that they're counting on to round out their high school transcript. There's going to be things that just aren't available to kids if we have to cut 12 teachers from the high school next year. So it is, I've characterized this as an education emergency. Coming out of the pandemic, I think our teachers, our families have done an amazing job supporting our kids as best as they can, but there has been real negative impacts of this situation that we can't avoid, and we're going to need to be giving kids more support, not less. So I am very concerned. On the one hand, and on the other hand, I'm very optimistic because I believe that Shrewsbury is a community that supports public education, that when they really, if they're paying attention and they see like this is what's at stake, I really believe people are going to be willing to make that investment. And it's still an incredibly cost-effective, from a taxpayer perspective. The value, even with this override, is still incredible in terms of the tax rate people are paying and what they're getting from municipal services, from school services. So I am confident and optimistic that the town is going to step up and support what the municipal departments and the school department are looking for. And it's using an approach that is, as Kevin said, gives some real certainty for the next 4 years that there's not going to be another ask. This is an ask that we're going to really work with for multiple years and gives us that stability. So I think it's an exciting time, but it's nerve-wracking at the same time because it's a huge decision that the town has to make on May 4th.
It is, and certainly, our students, even under the best of conditions and with great support from parents and with excellent educators, it's been a hugely disruptive year. And we know that there has been educational loss. And on the state level, we are investing dollars into understanding that our schools, our administrators, our educators, and our students need support this year. And certainly that is true at the local level. I think at the same time, and I would be remiss without mentioning it, we also are cognizant of this could be difficult for some people who live in our community, and all of us are cognizant of that, and sometimes a head and a heart have to make different decisions. But again, the selectmen, that has been something they've been speaking about, and certainly directing you as town manager to be thinking through how can we support members of our community that this might be a struggle for. And Kevin, could you just maybe speak to that for a minute in terms of the work that we're doing?
Yeah, so Well, first and foremost, maybe we don't talk about it enough, but you had mentioned it before, and Joe has mentioned it. There's a real healthy friction in these conversations that go on behind the scenes about, do we ask this question or not? It's it's not like we all show up and be like, yep, let's ask. Like it's the opposite of that. It's like, make your case, go back, refine your case, make your case again. I think you need to look at this more. The selectmen are, in the school committee are looking at these numbers going, you got more work to do if you think that we need to do this. So, all of that, we've actually led by Selectman DiPaolo, have studied the state's tax exemptions that are available to us. And there does seem to be a little bit of area that we can work within to provide some additional benefits to help offset some of those costs. But there's not a lot. We are definitely limited. But, I think we do have to reflect back on where we are. The average tax bill in Shrewsbury is just that. It's the state average. It's literally $5 within the state average. So no one, if you ask someone what's Shrewsbury, it's not average. I don't think so. That's not the feeling that people carry, whether they live here or not, about what Shrewsbury is as a community. So. And if I could just also touch back on, Joe's comments about educators, I worry about that on the municipal side too, attracting talent. We're benefiting, and while we're losing benefit from these well-tenured 30 or 40 year, long employees, Mr. Knight, Mr. Cox, those folks that, have been with the town, that really grew up here and were just, invested in the community, and we're competing in the global marketplace, so to speak. So one of the things I always hear in an interview, we ask people, why did you apply for this job? Well, Shrewsbury's a well-run community. Well, I hear it all the time. It has nothing to do with me. It has everything to do with the decades of work that, was done before us. And we can lose that. And then, we will just be an average community, which, no one wants to be. It's not what we think about when we think of Shrewsbury. It's not what I thought about whenever I applied. Right. I applied for the same reason. So.
Well, it's funny you say that, because in 2014 I talked a lot about that. That people that you speak to that work in the schools, are folks who work in the municipal side, are critical, and we take great pride in them. We have fantastic people who have made a choice to want to work in Shrewsbury. But it's also about, we knew in 2014 that Dan Morgado was, retirement was on his mind. And we were critically concerned then, if we didn't pass this and we had to start dismantling things, who would we attract to be our next town manager? And, our community came together, overwhelmingly recognized that we needed to make the decision to fund. And, we ended up having you arrive as our town manager, which again brings us to this moment when Joe is speaking about what you've brought to us in terms of thinking through how do we manage this fiscal situation we're in, and having a little bit of a longer understanding about how to do this and some forethought to it. And so people in your positions, in your level matters, and keeping Joe here as the superintendent is critically important for our school system. And it's also in the folks that we elect to serve in our community, again, and who are appointed to serve in different things. We have people step forward because we have an incredibly collegial, collaborative, productive, healthy friction, which is good to get to the right spot of all minds coming together. But whether you're looking at from the person who is in the lowest paid position in town to the person who's serving an elected office, everyone, the commonality is that we all feel grateful to be in Shrewsbury, to have this opportunity, and we all recognize this is an incredibly well-run community. And so that is, if you look at this as a purely financial decision around $9.5 million and you don't think about it anymore, you're going to miss, I think, the bigger piece of this, which is the reason we have been so fortunate to have such a well-managed community is because we have people like yourselves who are willing to serve. And also because we are doing things which we've illustrated in this conversation between the bond rating and in some of the decisions we make in terms of the school system on things to do to offset other costs that we're losing. Those are all deliberate decisions that have been made by people who understand that to be fiscally responsible is a number one priority. And so as a community, I think this decision that we're asking people to make is actually a fiscally responsible decision to invest dollars all together collectively as a community to ensure that this investment that we've all made as people can continue to pay dividends for us in the services that we value and require here. And so I'm hoping for people who watch today, I'm hoping you've learned more. I hope that you can sense in the discussion we've had the optimism that exists among the three of us, thinking that folks all around this decision-making process have done a lot of work to bring really good information to bear and to show a plan and a commitment and a level of transparency, I think, which is new and great, especially because we have some new tools that we're using here in town that really allow all voters to look into, I think, Clearview, correct me if I'm wrong.
ClearGov.
Yep. And as a finance committee member who has sat on finance committee on the team since 2014 and is well aware of the decisions that have been made in the investments, I would really urge you to take a good look. We have been showing some access to some of the ways that you can find more information via the website. Please take a look, give it some thought, and then hopefully you will turn out on Tuesday, May 4th, which is our upcoming municipal elections, and you will have a ballot that is two-sided. Don't forget the second side. But I want to thank you for listening to this conversation today, and I want to thank both of you for all the work that you do and for all the folks on our municipal and our school side day in and day out, and certainly for our elected officials who have done a ton of work. Thank you for all that you do.
Thank you.
Thank you.